Hello, everyone. Welcome to the January 2nd edition, our first scientific governance and risk meeting in 2020. So it's a new decade. Feels like the old one, but we'll see how it turns out. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development at MakerDAO. We are here to talk about governance. We're here to talk about risk. We're going to have a fairly low-key introduction into this year of crypto governance. I believe there's going to be take a bit of a cognitive catch-up to figure out what's been happening in the last 2 weeks for most of us, I believe, but we'll do our best. And to get us ramped up, though, we have some interesting things happening today. We have a presentation from community rock star Sam is going to talk a bit about the DSR spread. And this has been an interesting conversation that's surfaced and then submerged and then surfaced again over the last month or two, perhaps longer. I'm not going to steal his thunder, actually. I was going to give a bit of a preamble of what that was all about, but then that would be a bit rude. So I'll let Sam dig into those things. We're going to hear from Cyrus. He's going to give us a little update on the state of migration. Cyrus, do we have anybody to talk about the PEG today? Vishesh is here. Nice. All right, so let's assume the state of the pegs will be happening as well. I'm going to leave the usual speechifying about governance to the side today and maybe reserve that for a general Q&A at the end. One thing I did want to talk about, though, and this is an interesting conversation, I don't want to speechify as much as I want to ask questions of the group. Because we have an interesting situation that occurred recently with the GSM. And for people that are unfamiliar with what this is all about, there was an article posted on Medium that discussed in some fairly colorful terms a potential exploit in the ecosystem, in our ecosystem. I'm still undecided about the novelty of the attacks that were described. Basically, as far as I'm concerned, it comes down to somebody who has a sufficient amount of money is capable of co-opting skin in the game governance systems. That's not unique to our process. That's fairly common. That's exactly what skin in the game is all about. So anywhere in the world or any organization in the world that allows people to carry crypto and or stocks or what have you and treat them as a shareholder type organization is able to buy up votes and vote accordingly. So we had that situation brought to light. Happily, the protocol anticipated that. It's anticipated that from day one. You can go back to the white paper and find references to discussions about how to mitigate these things, but it's also referenced in the known risks. But one of those mitigations was something called the GSM. It's the governance shutdown module. So in response to this new sense of urgency, proposal went up, allowing the community to decide whether they felt the GSM was a prudent move, whether they wanted to do it now sooner than the roadmap had anticipated. And so here's how that shook out. In order to secure the existing system prior to the vote for the GSM, a significant number of maker holders sort of rallied together and secured the previous executive against attack. And so we had, I think, actually, I should double check before I make assertions like this, but I'm reasonably sure it was the largest amount of maker that was staked at any one time was staked on the existing executive for that week prior to the GSM going on, which was an amazing show of strength for the ecosystem and for our holders that they were able to rally, secure the system against attack and cause an attack to be fantastically expensive, which was really nice to see. Here's where things get weird, though. That secured executive, though nice to see, significantly raised the bar for the GSM vote to pass. And so what we saw was an interesting behavior where what what I'm viewing it as is as a war between urgency and apathy, and how rapidly one thing can turn to another in this space. It's also a little bit of an object lesson about external factors and how they can come into play here. We've seen how real world events have impacted the governance system before. Most notably in my mind, at least, was DevCon, where DevCon happened and people stopped voting because the voters were all in Japan in a different time zone and super busy. So that had an impact on our governance ecosystem. The GSM votes, the timing of that was not great with end of year as well. So what we had is this sense of urgency, an extremely solid current executive to secure the system, getting beefed up. And then the next week when it came time to move all of that maker into the GSM vote, that didn't happen. And that's an interesting behavior that I'd like to get some insight from this group here to see if people have theories about why that happened and how we can attempt to mitigate that type of activity in the future, because it's a tough one. We keep on running up against these situations where planned governance ecosystem butts up against real world utility of that ecosystem. And so we have continuous approval voting, which served us well through SED, and the size stability fee sort of butting up against a far more complex ecosystem where we have two universes and multiple levers, and getting people to secure and then move maker to new votes that represents the decisions that are outside the status quo has turned out to be a challenge. And so I want to kind of throw this to the group to see whether anybody has some thoughts or opinions about the GSM situation, or ideas about how we can tackle this thing the next time around. And actually, here's another question. I'm going to throw out a pile of them at you. What do we do now? Does the community still want the GSM? How do we surface that if that's the thing that needs to be done? It's going to be a tough one. I wonder if I should just call on people. Mariana, what do you think? Oh, there you go.
Actually, can I say a couple words? So I think that the what happened with the GSM was that initially everybody kind of realized, okay, there's a zero delay, there's this potential attack, but on the other hand, there was a very legitimate reason why we went through not having a time delay at first, because the system is new, it needs time. And I think that there were trade-offs that weren't fairly captured by Micah's article. And so I think we didn't, do like the best job of convincing maker holders one way or the other. So right now we're kind of at like this point where do we want to go forward? Do we need maker holders to kind of understand the trade-off and decide if it's been enough time? Because I don't think that it was so much of a risk of an attack as much as there was also a very legitimate reason,
Because that's something that I noticed through the course of the event as well, is that this urgency apathy trade-off, and watching is sort of like the stages of denial. I don't know, we'll make up a new one for the stages of crypto governance, but it seems like urgency and apathy are the two ends of the spectrum. And we saw why wasn't this taken care of years ago, slowly shift over time to hold on, maybe this isn't a big problem after all, to shifting that to having a new contingent arise saying like, well, maybe we do need agility more than we need security, and then how do we handle those trade-offs? And so over the course of that week, the debate got more nuanced, which was really nice to see. So I guess, to be fair, I laid out these options of why the GSM didn't go through, and it was a bit prejudicial of me not to offer up this suggestion. Maybe the community just decided that GSM is not a great idea. So perhaps that's what happened. Maybe I'm being overly cynical. So the question becomes, I guess, to add some more color to it, maybe the GSM just isn't the idea right now. And so that's, the community has spoken. So.
But should it be repolled for, or should it be re-voted on or included in the next vote?
Well, this is where things get very, very interesting. It's not for us to say as Maker Foundation employees, because this is a community-led initiative. So it's up to the community to decide whether they feel that the GSM should have gone through and didn't, for reasons that were mechanical or social or what have you, or whether that was a legitimate decision and the urgency was misplaced. I'm not entirely sure.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Martin.
Yes.
Cool. I would say that, yeah, there were trying circumstances when we created that poll, and I believe, like, my recommendation would be, if I can make one, would be to do it again soonish. You know, the smart contracts are there. It's in the white paper, like you said. The idea is to have a GSM sooner rather than later. So I would do it again, maybe January. I don't know. And I agree that the community needs to come together about that, but having a zero delay forever is not in our best interest either.
Well, there's another interesting question that are, sorry, go ahead.
Did anybody look at the vote stats, like the distribution of voters, like why? Did anybody do an analysis on why the GSM vote didn't pass?
I don't know. I did not.
Alex did.
I mean, my point is we might be hitting this situation where the community did want it, but obviously a few larger MKR holders didn't follow through.
Yeah.
The will of the community is not necessarily 100% aligned with the will of the MKR holders, and that's obviously tricky.
Yeah, well, you're
discussion.
opening a whole, turning over a can of worms there. That's alarming, right? Because this is something. This is one of those things that I keep on bringing up that people are sick of hearing, I think, so they don't hear me anymore. But we still haven't quite determined exactly what the community is, and how that gets quantified and where they are. And so when I say the community, I have a tendency to mix and alternate between referencing people that show up in the forums and the people that actually vote. And I'm not sure that there's a clear distinction there. The distinction in my mind might not be the one that's shared by everybody else. So it's a tough question.
And so while the foundation itself specifically can't say we should or we will do this, does the foundation or risk teams or any party have a recommendation to do it? And to me, that's a theme that we're going to start off, at least I will, all the time now. We'll be asking, you know, when we talk about, well, should be a stability fee or a savings rate or this module, what is the recommendation? And if the recommendation is one thing, then at least the rest of us can hear what other people who are in a role can define as what is recommended.
Yeah, I keep on coming back to that as well, Matthew, is this idea that we have this amorphous group of people that sort of come in and come out through this revolving door of what community is, and they engage with the system and they do some votes and then they leave. We see this issue, and Mariano kind of just touched on that too, where ideas need to be surfaced and they need to be owned and they need to have sort of a campaign behind them, I think, where these things need to be discussed. And so expecting these things to organically emerge and then have enough stickiness to move governance on their own, I think might be naive. We haven't seen a lot of good examples of that. And so the question becomes, we have this model already where empowered actors, people that have domain knowledge that are, you know, by their varying definition, experts in their fields, does the community start or continue to empower actors to make decisions, or at least provide opinions or be judgmental or opinionated about some of these ideas? And that's a very tricky question that I don't have a lot of clarity on yet. But we have risk teams at some point in the future. We're going to need people that are willing to make legal opinions, and we need to have people that are willing to make, you know, to look at people's books and make fundamental opinions about things and publish those. Who's going to do that and how they're incentivized to continue to do that are open questions right now. But as this maps back to the current conversation, so the GSM is a thing. So we saw this sort of peak and valley of sentiment and interest and engagement, but that was largely driven by social media, and then it sort of followed that same tail of life cycle of social media, where everybody is extremely upset furiously upset about something, and then they saw something shiny, and now they're upset about something else, and who knows what they're upset about 2 weeks later. So how do we maintain the thread when we have something that's important to the protocol, and how do we ensure that that doesn't get lost? So are these votes a single kick at the can? It didn't work. All right, let's move on with our lives. Or is this something that needs to be resurfaced and dealt with? These are all very, very tricky questions, and I'm not entirely sure whose job it is to do that kind of thing. So that's something to think about. I would love for somebody to provide the answer to me, preferably packaged up in a forum thread with a vote attached. If you could, that'd be great. Thanks. We can pick this up at the end of the call to discuss more of it, or if anybody just wants to percolate on those ideas for a while, those questions, resurface them again during the rest of the call. But I don't want to use up too much time here because we do have some interesting things happen. So I think I'm going to hand this off to you, Sam, so we can hear about the DSR spread. I'm very interested in this idea.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So let me just share my screen. Sorry about this. I'm having to change my permissions. Uh-oh. I have to restart, I guess. 1 second.
All right. No problem. Tech demos. I'll get you every time. Richard Burton is on the call. Richard Burton, how are you doing, man? That's an interesting question or observation you made in the sidebar too, and it's something that I've been waiting for a while. So I think this might be coming. For people that are watching this later, they don't have access to the chat. So Rich points out that protocol politicians are going to be interesting. So this is a governance ecosystem, and right now it's in its prototypical state, but there's all these attendant behaviors that presumably will come as things get more sophisticated, as more people get engaged, as the stakes get higher, or people's individual stakes get higher, I suppose. And this ties back to the thing that we were just talking about, who's motivated to campaign for different ideas and to ensure that these threads don't get dropped. And one of the things we might see in the future is people self-organizing into groups to ensure that. So figuring out who is most invested in a lower and or higher DSR, and then having those people coordinate potentially through some tooling to ensure that they can collect their votes and make some decisions.
Instead of doing like a one-time fix for the GSM, maybe we should put together like a process for executive votes that don't pass, because this has happened a couple times now, right? Like, should we redo for example, we could just rerun the executive vote, or we could rerun the governance poll as like a gut check and then rerun the executive vote, or, something that we don't just kind of keep dealing with these like weird, same thing with when just a few weeks ago when we got lucky, right, where we didn't have to do 2 executive votes.
Yeah. So some kind of
like
mechanism where there's just a poke that poll just to make sure that people actually did.
Yeah, we need some more generic solutions to some of these polling issues, rather than like,
be careful.
Should we redo the
careful,
GSM?
Cyrus. But only be careful on one aspect. In this GSM component, I think it's, in my opinion, is more timely related to holidays than anything else. However, don't let the scenario creep up where, because it didn't pass, that meant we just have to run it again, because that must have meant people wanted to do it, but they didn't get a chance to do it, when actually maybe the real underlying ethos was that the vote should have been no.
Yeah, or you run into a situation where active voters vote against something in 1 week, and then if you keep on surfacing that vote, perhaps you're just waiting for people to stop noticing and then have that thing squeeze through. So there's, nothing is easy in this space.
But I mean, that should all be surfaced in the governance poll, right? The executive vote is at least currently designed to just ratify what we actually voted on in the governance poll.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Some
turnout.
mechanism to
Yes. Yeah, if there's sufficient turnout on that, on the polling side, yeah, but in scenarios where the poll turned out, 1,000 maker voted and it was a yes or no, but when we needed 80,000 to get it cleared through an executive.
Well, the next part of that discussion is obviously thresholding, right? So, and this is something that makes me hyper nervous, but maybe that's one of the qualifications. So if a vote goes through and it's under X participation or there are X unique voters, then you can assume that perhaps it wasn't strong.
Right. I mean, well, the GSM poll was very strong, right?
Yeah.
So maybe it's
so
almost like if maybe it can be maybe part of that process can be executive polls rerun if the governance poll had sufficient turnout or something to avoid the issue with the just 1,000 MKR voting on the governance poll.
All right, Sam, I think did you get your technical difficulties sorted?
Yep, I'm good to go.
All right, yeah, so let's kick this off then. Let's see what you got.
All right. You see everything?
Yep.
Okay, so let me just get this out of the way. So MakerDAO, a governance model. So this presentation comes out of more thought on and discussion that's happening in the forum thread. I figured I'd make a presentation to kind of illustrate my thoughts on this a bit more. So here we go. So background, who is this guy? My name is Sam MacPherson, aka Hexanaut or Sam M. I'm a maker enthusiast, a programmer, a business owner, and I started the DSR spread versus absolute DSR signaling threads in the forum. So from Psi to Die. So Psi had really only a few parameters that we were messing around with before. There's a few more, but there was mainly one parameter for peg stability and 2 parameters for risk. So you know all these numbers likely. So Die sort of complicates this by having a bunch more parameters exposed. Stuff we all probably know. There's the global parameters, the stability fee and the Die savings rate. There's the per vault type parameters, the stability fee, collateralization ratio, and liquidation penalty. Again, there's more, but these are the main ones in my view. So why do we need a governance model? So I think this is my assertion, is that we do need a governance model, and we need it because it does a couple things. So for one, it provides simplification. So abstraction is one of the best tools we have to simplify complex systems. I think we should use abstraction in maker governance to provide simplification. We have consensus. So governance models, I would say ambiguity is the enemy of consensus. We need to form consensus around these parameters. And if there's a sort of an ambiguous situation, it can lead to like vote splits and not provide clarity in these votes. So without an opinionated model, we may arrive at multiple valid solutions for a single problem. And so this is a problem in my view. So another thing that a governance model provides, at least a good one, is scalability. So we should be separating concerns, and we should, so separation of concerns is required for scalability, and a good governance model should scale up with the system.
What exactly do you mean by separation of concerns?
So like splitting out votes for say peg stability and risk parameters, those should be completely separate in order to facilitate ease of sort of clarity on votes and stuff like that.
So you're referring to like the roll-up model with the executive right now is problematic.
Yeah, so then we can have a group for like peg stability and a group for risk parameters, and we don't have them all muddled together.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so the current model for governance, I think we just kind of rolled out sort of what the obvious first values were. So having the DSR and the FBAT stability fee values as absolute percentages, is an obvious first choice. It seemed fine for now. Migration, in my view, has largely been a success, so it's been great. But I believe we can improve for post-migration. So here's a problem I'm seeing. So there's ambiguity with the peg stability. So here's a question that I'm not sure we can answer clearly with the current governance polls. So DAI is trading at 102 USD. What actions do we take to correct this? With single collateral DAI, it was fairly obvious, like just raise the stability fee. With multi-collateral DAI, we have two options really. Like we can raise the stability fee or raise the DAI savings rate. They both apply sort of similar functions. So the question is like, which do we choose? And I don't think there's clarity around that right now.
Don't you mean decrease the DAI stability fee? The DAI stability fee. I mean, the DAI savings rate. My bad. Waffling over here.
No,
I think
we
that's
want
an example
to...
of the lack of clarity, right? So people have very different opinions about how to incentive it.
No, it would be raise the DSR.
If it was trading above the peg, wouldn't you want to lower the DSR so that there's more supply on the market and so that there's less getting locked into the DSR?
1 second.
Yeah, if it's trading above, you wouldn't want more demand, you'd want less, and you'd want more supply, so you'd lower the stability fee. And maybe you.
Let me think on that, and I'll come back to that. But I'm pretty sure you want to raise it to increase demand for DAI. Or sorry, maybe I had it backwards. Okay, maybe a mistake on that slide. I wrote it a little fast. So here is a lemma I will propose. So let D equal the DSR, S equal the global stability fee, and C equal the DSR spread. So for all rational market conditions and fixed C, DSR spread, there exists unique S such that both D equals S minus C and the DAI price equals 1 USD. So what this implies to me is that we can maintain peg stability by only voting on the global stability fee and having the DSR follow it around minus some constant. This provides clarity with the unique S. That's the key point. So I think we should have one vote, one function. So governance votes should be clear signals of the will of the community. We can disambiguate the peg stability problem by changing the questions. What should the global stability fee be? Like peg stability control. And the second question is, what should the DAI savings rate spread be? And this controls system profit and growth control. So these two questions encode the exact same system parameters, but by changing the phrasing, we can get distinct answers to the questions in the governance polls. So more generally, here's how I'm viewing a model for governance. So we have the system parameters, which translates into governance votes, which has what their interpretation is. So we have, in this example, the global stability fee being 4%, the DSR spread being 1%, and for example, FA, FB being 1 and 2%. So what these are interpreted as, so like the vault fees can be completely interpreted as risk premium for that particular vault type. So if FB is at 2%, it means we expect 2% per year of bad debt. And the idea is to hit that number exactly at break even so that it follows the real world as closely as possible. So the other pieces are the global stability fee. 4% is the number that we've arrived at to ensure peg stability at $1. And the DSR spread is at 1%, which implies that 1% of system supply should be taken as profit to maker holders. So notice that's a distinct answer or a distinct interpretation from raising or lowering to affect peg stability. So pros and cons to this. Pros, stability fee vote is reduced to 1 vote. That's nice. Risk premiums can be captured directly in a vault fee. And more importantly, splitting risk, peg stability, and growth profit decisions into 3 separate governance votes. This goes back to separation of concerns. So the cons are less flexibility in general. We are picking, we're making a decision to be more specific and interpret things in a specific way. So we lose some flexibility. There's also an ongoing discussion about we lose low volatility collateral types, maybe priced out. So for example, borrowing DAI against USDC may not make sense at 5% total fees. I'm not sure if this is a problem, but discussion is ongoing on that. So in conclusion, whether the presented model is the best fit, definitely open for discussion, but it's clear to me at this stage we need to start making more opinionated decisions on how we map high-level goals onto system parameters. All right, thank you.
Oh, okay, that was awesome, but there's a lot in there, so you're not off the hook yet. Can you go back to the pros and cons tab?
Yep.
Try and internalize some of this stuff. So yeah, hopefully we'll hear from the risk team or the more financially opinionated people on the call. Where I am unclear about the solution here is around flexibility, right? So that feels like a trade-off to me, but that comes down to likelihood. Maybe Cyrus, you can pipe up here. What are some examples of flexibility we would lose in a system like this? When is it that we need to make decisions, or the community should make a decision about the different levers that may be counterintuitive that wouldn't follow a model like this?
I'm not sure it's actually less flexible. So I'd maybe pass it back to Sam to
yeah, so it's like, technically speaking, it's the exact same parameters, right? We're just kind of encoding them in a different way. But yeah, you can totally arrive at the DSR at any number and the global stability fee at any number, same as it is now. But it's more from like an interpretation sense, where we are like restricting ourselves to just moving around the global stability fee to affect peg stability, as opposed to right now, we're kind of in the mindset where we can either like raise or lower the DSR, or raise or lower the global stability fee, or even we could do it with the vault fees as well. But so what I'm asserting is that we should like make an opinionated choice on how we proceed with these sort of votes, just to keep things like less ambiguous. So it's less flexible in sort of the abstract sense, not in the technical sense.
Excuse me, can I jump in here for a quick question?
Sure. Yeah, please do.
Okay, so I am looking at the cons, and the low volatility collateral types may be priced out is the one concern that I have, right? Because with DAI, you're trying to get collateral that is outside of the blockchain or tokenized collateral in the future, like real estate. And that's going to be much more stable and more secure in theory, but it's also going to be much less volatile than crypto collateral and other collateral that we can use. So I would like to learn a bit more about this discussion and why some people may think this is a problem, and how it will be a problem, and how these fees will push away the low volatility collateral from DAI.
Let me try to clarify that point a little bit, because I wouldn't consider this proposal as being I wouldn't consider this con as being necessarily part of the proposal. So because again, just the proposal of thinking about the spread is just a different way of thinking about it. So if we wanted to include a lower volatility collateral type, you could just vote on a negative spread if the DSR were to be too high. So for example, if the DSR was 5% and you wanted the stability fee to be 3%, then the poll for that particular vault fee could just have negative ranges as well. So, and then would technically still be fine. So I think the point that's being raised is a valid point, but not necessarily under the context of the proposal of shifting the polls to a spread format.
Right. So are you saying run the DSR spread at a negative amount, or the vault fees?
The spread between the DSR and the total stability fee for that collateral type. Right. So okay. So the way I think about it is, the governance polling is just an interface for the community to express their views on what they want to what they want the system to look like, right? None of the parameters we vote on the polls are actually the parameters that get input, right? Like the DSR is some like 27 digit long number that just like compounds into 4%, right? It's not feasible to vote on the system parameters exactly as they're input into the system. So the polling should be designed to most conveniently allow the community to express what they actually want to do for the system. So in the case of the DSR spread in the presentation, like what the community would, in theory, at least that's the hypothesis, would more like to do is vote on the base DSR and then vote on a risk premium spread for the collateral types, right? And then as long as you allow that spread in the polls to be negative, then this second con wouldn't necessarily apply. You could still have it. It would just be subsidized, right?
Yeah, and so, okay, this is, after having thought about this for a while, I'm also wondering, why are we subsidizing collateral types if we are trying to reduce supply of dye? Because we're raising interest rates to reduce the supply. So why would we want to be subsidizing certain collateral types?
Well, that's certainly an interesting question and a bit of a separate discussion, but multiple reasons. One is simply from a bootstrapping / growth angle. If you want to, if the launch of MCD was kind of this metaphorical sign that we're open for business, right? It's not necessarily as easy to get the word out to collateral partners. And so having a rate that's more in line with what people would traditionally expect, that is kind of not held accountable to the DSR, which can be quite high at times, maybe makes sense from a business perspective. And then it could also make sense from a diversification perspective as well. If potentially having different collateral types, even if they're at a negative spread, might improve the risk profile of the portfolio.
Right.
Can you envision a situation where some collateral doesn't get the same rate of return as other collateral? For example, low volatility collateral?
Yeah, of course. I mean, different collateral types should have different stability fees based on their characteristics.
Do we have anything written about this?
Yes, we have a ton of we have some stuff coming in the next couple of weeks, I promise. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Can we please move back and see the actual proposal for the governance change? Right here, thank you.
So the actual proposal that's going through the forums is just for the DSR spread, but this was sort of a more general view of how I'm viewing the system, because what I got out of the discussion going on in the thread was that there was, I think, a lot of different views for what parameters are encoding what, and so this is sort of my view, like how we should be looking at these parameters and what their interpretations should be.
So if I'm looking at your chart right there correctly, for ETH B fee of 2%, what is the total? Just imagine you're the borrower for a moment. What is the total cost of capital for borrowing against that collateral type? In this case,
6%.
is it 3 plus 1 plus 2, 6?
Okay. Yeah.
Can you go back 1 or 2 slides before where you referenced basically the math? You had some equation in there, 2 slides
This?
prior.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, and I just remembered. So David, you were right. That should have read 98 cents on the previous slide. This one, that was a mistake.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I just wanted, for the sake of just being correct, like in general, for all of us to be accurate with stuff. But yeah, no doubt.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, good catch.
So going actually, I'm going to talk about that chart for a sec. So I think, just at least the way I understood from the original threads was that the global stability fee would equal the DSR pretty much, I think, always.
Well, if it's the
it would
spread's
just
at
be
0%, it would.
The spread's at 0%, it would. Yeah, I guess I got to go back and revisit the original thread and kind of think back to what. But I think the idea is generally correct. But I think so what would be the poll here that you're suggest, or the poll format?
It would be well, we haven't really got into the vault fees yet, so we'll ignore risk for now. But it would be well, it's what's listed under the governance votes right here minus the FB fee. So it'll be what's the DSR spread, what's the global stability fee. The bottom 2 governance votes, and those are interpreted on the right as what's written.
It's a good presentation. Thank you for putting it together.
Yeah, very cool.
No problem.
I'll check this out as well.
Yeah, do you guys want to move on or something? It seems like we're just sitting here staring at it.
Well, everybody knows how much I enjoy awkward silences, but it felt like people were actually internalizing things, so I didn't want to actually put a halt to it. So this is great. Thanks, Sam, for this. I posted the link to the thread in the chat, so please, everyone, click on that link and review the discussion to date. This is a great presentation. Thank you for that. It also is a great example of one of the issues we talked about at the beginning of the call, where how do we maintain momentum and how do we ensure that threads don't get dropped? And I think that Sam just gave us a great example of how that should be handled by owning this idea and actually coming up with a slide presentation for us. So I really appreciate that.
Yep, no problem.
All right, Cyrus, I'm going to turn this over to you if you want to talk about what's going on in risk.
Sure.
By the way, I apologize for removing the system collateralization just before the call.
Well, we're assuming that you're fixing it right now as we watch you type in the other window.
I am. On the other hand, it is really fast now.
All right. Okay, so the dye supply has still been increasing somewhat steadily, I think. It's up to 73 million now. I think it's up maybe 4 or 5 million from a couple of weeks ago from our last call. So I mean, migration has still, I mean, it is slowing, but I kind of think it's still at a decent pace. If it were to go 5 million every couple of weeks at this stage, I think that's pretty neat. We also just passed a new executive vote with new debt ceiling. So ETH debt ceiling is up to 100 million, and the Psy debt ceiling is down to 70 million. Let's quickly jump to Psy for a second. So Psy is now below 40 million, which is, I think, a pretty good sign. Collateralization ratio has been improving slightly as well. Yeah, not much to say. And then other than maybe we could even consider continuing to lower the debt ceiling on Psy. I think at this point, there really isn't as much of a need for having that much buffer. Potentially at launch, we were anticipating, you know, some, I guess, a bit more market activity and the potential need for market makers to absorb some of the extra supply from the secondary lenders. Now that I think the secondary lending supply has started to diminish for Psy, I don't think there's a need. I just think it's a bit of an unnecessary risk to have a 30 million additional buffer for Psy right now. The DSR utilization rate is at 41%, which is a new ATH, a new all-time high. This is definitely partly because of Compound. Compound integrated DSR into their platform. Not sure if there's been any activity from OKX regarding this. Forgot to follow up on that. If anybody knows, would be interested in hearing about that. One interesting thing is about Psy is that there's still about 6 million Psy in Compound, which is not moved over. The DAI markets have full functionality now, so you can borrow against deposited DAI. So there's really not much reason for the Compound Psy to be sitting there, but it is. The rate differential isn't huge, but I think we're reaching a point where we can maybe consider that Compound Psy to be somewhat sticky. The MKR in the burner hit 10,000, which is also pretty cool. That's represents over 1% of MKR in supply has been burned. There's still about 2.5 million, I think, of unpaid SCD fees, which is about half of where we were when the migration started, when MCD launched. But interestingly, I think like one really large CDP accounts for about a third of the unpaid fees. That's definitely a conversation to be had around the unpaid fees there. And I think the three largest CDPs account for about 40% of the unpaid fees. Let me see, just running to my notes. And then according to sentiment, about 6 million Psy hasn't moved in more than a year, which is another interesting point. I mean, between the unpaid fees and some inactive Psy, and with the migration maybe starting to show signs of slowing down, we can maybe start putting together some estimates for kind of what our target is for Psy supply, what our plan for emergency shutdown is, what the plan for fees are, and so on. I think that's it, really. don't have. It's been a fairly slow couple weeks in the market, so I don't think there's been much going on.
Cyrus, on the sentiment measure that you actually mentioning, is it actually the side that is actually in like a wallets or potentially side that is also on some particular contract?
Good question. I don't know right now. Oh, actually, yeah, I think it's for inactive wallets, not for anything that's been locked in secondaries or anything like that.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
Another interesting thing is I think there has been a considerable amount of Psi activity that has been borrowed and I think migrated over, and for the and kind of exploiting that maybe 1% arbitrage. I don't have exact numbers, but that's been something interesting. And I think we can look at those numbers and maybe estimate that those market makers won't be closing their CDPs either. They're just waiting for emergency shutdown. So yeah, a bunch of kind of different disparate pieces that we need to start tying together in terms of trying to start planning out what we're going to do for the next several months. Sorry, one last thing on distribution of Psi wallets. I think about 100 addresses hold roughly 30 million, or 2/3 of the remaining Psi. Just another interesting data point in terms of how we might start thinking about the future. Anybody have any thoughts on emergency shutdown, or maybe target size supply or anything like that? All right, well, I think migration's been going well. I think DAI supply is still growing, so there isn't really much urgency as far as I can tell. And I think the pegs are more or less fine, but I'll let Vishesh touch upon that. But yeah, I think as long as we just kind of continue to monitor the migration, should be fine. Where is the sentiment analysis on inactive Psi? Primoz, do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, it's on their webpage. I'm going to share a link. Here we go.
All right. I guess, Vishesh, do you want to do a state of the peg?
Okay. So yeah, just to touch on the total volume on DAI has been pretty light in the last 24 hours. Over the last week or so, it's again been relatively light, but it's dipped slightly below the peg. So we can just touch on that. Yeah, again, really tiny trading volume compared to usual. So things have been quiet. I guess people are away for holidays, not really doing much trading right now. But yeah, overall price, again, slightly below peg. It had drifted a little bit more than that during the holiday break, but again, on light volumes, so I'm not sure very many people noticed. But overall, I would say in the last week or so, you know, with that average being between 99 cents and $1, that's nothing to be severely concerned about, in my opinion. It's interesting to see these sort of microstructures really emerge when there's lower volumes, which is kind of interesting. Everything kind of normalizes at higher volumes, but when you have these really light trading days, you can see just Uniswap sort of spread throughout all the price ranges, Coinbase centered right around the one weighted average, and then Oasis again following a similar curve to Coinbase and then having a little bit more of a spread. It's just cool to notice that every now and then. As far as Psy, just one of the impactful things was what's happened to Psy on secondary lending. Just kind of died a little bit, which is theoretically a good thing for migration. So again, not going to double up with Cyrus, but we talked about the progress of migration pretty significantly moving along. In terms of what's going on with secondary lending platforms, I think this is an important thread, especially as we're talking about things like DSR spread as a major lever for governance and for deciding what happens to monetary policy, because it doesn't necessarily make sense to always just think of DSR versus stability fee. That's just two variables. There are at least four important variables, which is DSR versus stability fee versus the average borrow rates out there versus the average supply rates out there. And it's those four variables and how they all kind of relate to each other. So I think maybe that's a thread to follow up on. But we'll come back to that. So just currently for Psy, I already touched on those supply rates are very low, and the borrow rates have come up. Volumes have, you know, cratered pretty significantly. So that's all good for MCD, which is seeing a solid 20 million in supply and about 9 million in borrow. Again, rates are kind of low compared to what you might have seen in the past for SCD, but so that I think there's just some naturally different dynamics for how secondary lending has been working for MCD versus how it worked for SCD. And the major notable difference is the fact that there is a DSR now. So if we're just triangulating on what might be different now versus before, that seems to be the only major piece that actually legitimately functions differently. So this is going to be something that's interesting to watch because in the absence of, you know, say 30 million DAI locked up in the DSR, in the SCD world, you were seeing much higher both borrow rates and yields. Now it helps that the stability fee is significantly lower now, but even during migration, we saw that supply rate sort of jump up above the DSR, above the stability fee at certain points. So that's just kind of something that's interesting to monitor is this. So I was doing some thinking while we were on this call, but monitoring the borrow rate versus the stability fee and the DSR versus the supply rates. So this borrow rate is currently just slightly above. Just looking at compound here, we'll loop back to the RDX next time, but just at or slightly above the stability fee, and then the supply being at or slightly below the DSR. So this is really interesting, that dynamic. A, they're very close, which is just something to note in and of itself, but B, it's theoretically very slightly cheaper to borrow DAI currently from Maker, at least for ETH. And it's currently very slightly more attractive to supply DAI to the DSR than it is to Compound. Again, there's different risk parameters theoretically, and that's a whole other conversation to touch on at some point. But just in terms of pure rates, that's a very interesting dynamic. Really tiny margins, so not a ton to index on there. But I would watch the relationships of those 4 variables rather than just the spread between the 2. And I think that's, I'm sure people will have comments on that point. One other thing that I ran this time, just because that would be interesting to show, and it's convenient that the collateral ratio was off die stats at the exact same time, is the collateral ratio breakdown. So this is just a stacked bar of the total ETH MCD supply. And I've kind of banded the supply into different collateralization ratio buckets, which you can think of as risk buckets, because the collateralization ratio is the prime indicator of like financial risk in the system, at least at face value. There's a lot more that goes on under the hood here in terms of behaviors and how this changes over time and how it responds to different external factors. But in the simplest terms, you can think of this as like a banded visualization of the total risk right now. So yeah, it's interesting. Like I mentioned briefly in the chat, the top 12 CDPs account for roughly half the ETH DAI supply, with an average collateralization ratio in the 270s there. So that's a comparatively low collateralization ratio for a decent chunk of the MCD supply. So I kind of colored everything below 300% collateralized as sort of a red to yellowish color. And you can see here that that's, about half of the total DAI supply. And then the higher collateralizations, you can see here at, I would call it about 325, 350 or higher. What's interesting is for a decent chunk of SCD's life cycle, and I know we talked about on a previous call that this was primarily due to dropping ETH prices, but that has had a chance to stabilize. So this is a bit of a sticky behavior, it seems. You can see that a very comparatively small chunk of the total DAI supply is more than 350% collateralized compared to what things were like more often during SCD's life cycle. So I would say that it's interesting to just view this accumulation of risk here, and to see maybe, people's preferences have changed, or they've sort of learned that they had kept too much of a buffer in collateral in the SCD world and now are seeking a higher risk tolerance. Or maybe it's an effect of what's been going on with ETH prices. Again, hard to always guess at why people are doing things, but I think it's just interesting to note that this spread, this distribution exists. And then, yeah, like I said, top 3 CDPs, their vaults, account for about 23 out of 72-ish million of the ETH DAI. And yeah, 11, 8, 4, 2, pretty decently concentrated to the top few CDPs, I think is my point there. So that's something interesting to note. One other slight point was just DAI and size supply collectively over time is just dipped slightly. So this was something that we touched on with regards to migration in terms of what the sum of these 2 supplies have looked like. So obviously, everybody's aware that DAI supply has come up and size supply has come down. But the combination of the 2 is kind of a representation of the total borrowing power out there in terms of DAI. And a lot of people have kind of triangulated on this. I think the point that I made during migration was to just watch when this starts to come down, because that will probably indicate the beginning of the end of migration. So it seems that things are quieting down now. it's possible that, you know, during these times, a lot of people were keeping an amount of both psi and dai during migration, but just for a short time period. So it makes sense for this to kind of level out. Okay, that is all there. I'm sure this was just a point that I think was relevant to that presentation, and something for us to just kind of think about going forward was there are multiple levers here and none of them exists in a silo. So when you move one, you have to think about what is the market sort of benchmarking that variable against. And I think for the stability fee, it's against what are the other borrow rates that are out there. And for the DSR, I think it's against what are the other supply rates out there. For MKR governance, I understand that a big point is just what's the spread between the DSR and the stability fee, and that's something to manage in terms of just managing the system itself. But I think we have to visualize out what's the interplay between all three of these. Like, what's the impact of the delta between, you know, the borrow rates that exist out there and the stability fee on supply, total supply? What's the impact on this versus secondary lending supply? And how do those two things relate? Because, you know, theoretically, the total amount of secondary lending supply then, or secondary lending borrow then impacts the rates that exist out there, which then impacts, you know, the utilization of the DSR. So it's just, I think the point that I'm making here is it's a little bit complex and worth visualizing out how all these variables relate to each other. And I think we tend to want to fall into a trap of trying to come up with the simplest answer possible as well, which I understand is necessary for good management. So that'll be a discussion. But that is all I've got for today.
So I have a question. It's sort of my view that Maker sort of leads these rates because it is sort of the base protocol. Do these secondary lending markets, like if you raise and lower the DSR, should they not just roughly follow that? Like we lead, basically?
So this was a even simpler discussion in the past with just the secondary lending rates versus the stability fee. And in that world, it was still unclear what is the leading versus lagging relationship, right? And I think generally the rule or the thought process was when you're making a change to the stability fee, it's obviously going to have an impact on secondary lending rates. But the question is, once you leave the stability fee stable, what happens to those secondary lending rates then theoretically becomes an indicator of what your supply and demand levels are. And so that's really the underlying mechanic that we're trying to sort of dance around, because you can't theoretically have a really good measure of demand. At least we haven't come up with one yet that I've seen, but you're sort of managing for hidden variables. And so when you're doing that, these secondary lending behaviors become really important indicators. And I think what you do to the stability fee, for example, doesn't have a predictable one-to-one impact on price. That's something that we've looked at before, but it does when you're able to account for demand, when you're able to account for external impacts, price changes, et cetera. And so the problem is just there are a number of variables to manage for, and it's never, I think, in the history of Maker been as simple as when you increase the stability fee, price stabilizes by X amount. And I don't think that kind of relationship has ever been cleanly determined. So the answer to your question is yes, theoretically Maker is leading, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to predict what will happen to secondary lending rates in a time scale.
Yeah, but it's true that, like, if you increase the stability fee again and again and again, you'll eventually hit a point where you're balancing the numbers. Like, and that's same with the DSR, right? You're just increasing demand, and you know, it's not like 1-to-1, raise it by 1% or whatever, and you get X number of new demand or something like that. But there exists some number. If you keep raising and lowering, you'll hit it, and that is the equilibrium point. Is that not true?
Yeah, and so this is all kind of about managing that equilibrium point. So the other point here is how, like, if you were to take a model that just incorporates the spread between the DSR and the stability fee, how do you then manage for what impact a sudden change in ETH price would have on the DAI price, and making sure that you have an appropriate stability fee that works not just for the current state, but also over time and is stable, right? So what we've seen in the past, I think, is you can make the stability fee extremely low, but then when there's a sudden windfall in ETH prices, you end up damaging the peg or seeing a cratering in DAI price, and then you have to overcorrect. And I think things have been comparatively quiet recently, but it's hard to say whether that's necessarily the right, set of parameters going forward, or even currently, given a potential change in ETH price, right? It's hard to say what's stable from market conditions.
Right, but this would get back to my lemma I wrote in the presentation. Like, there exists unique stability fees with the DSR spread following it around, or the DSR rather, that such that there is a unique number. We don't know what that number is, but like, if we keep moving around, in theory, we should be able to hit that number at some point. At least that's my view on it.
In terms of moving around the spread or moving around the stability fee?
The stability fee.
Yeah, I mean, the DSR primarily exists to soak up oversupply. And so I think it's helpful to sort of talk about what's the impact of each parameter. Stability fee primarily serves to impact the overall supply, and then the DSR primarily serves to impact an absorption of oversupply, or providing a small amount of additional low risk yield for some people that theoretically just want to lock up some capital and collect a stable 4% over time. So visualizing out, like, when you do the combination of those two parameters, theoretically what you're managing for is what is supply versus demand, and the usage of that DSR should theoretically increase when there is more oversupply out there, i.e. when demand goes down. But if you, for example, see a sudden cratering in the ETH price, and now leverage becomes extremely more attractive, DSR is not going to make much of a difference. What's going to have an impact is the stability fee. So I agree with you that you're managing for that equilibrium, but it's almost like the stability fee is a more important parameter for that equilibrium for the peg, and then the DSR is a more important parameter for having an impact on secondary lending rates. So it's sort of like you're managing for two different things at the same time, and which makes sense because you have two different parameters you're managing at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. It's a good point.
Vishesh, I'm quite interested in that graph that you presented around the collateralization rates for those CDPs. Have you noticed whether actually there was actually an impact of taking over risk during actually the maybe recent low volatility time frames, or is that kind of something that has already been observed for a while?
So yeah, and that particular graph is not currently a time series, but that represents current state. That current state, from my observation, has not changed significantly since the launch of MCD. And what I have noticed is that it does appear to be a bit different from what I observed in the past with SCD. In terms of whether that's responsive to market volatility or not, I think and this is actually probably a broader just assumption of how you think about maker risk, that those collateralization ratios tend to be a long-term representation of preference of user behavior and risk tolerance versus what are the yields out there. And it may be more of a function of not market volatility, but rather the yields and the stability fee currently, right? So given those lower rates, it may be that that's a reason for that higher risk. And so that's something to consider, is what are the variables that drive risk, right? So we're primarily thinking about the PEG when we talk about monetary policy and risk parameters, but it obviously makes sense to also talk about risk when talking about risk parameters. And so the impact that those parameters have on the risk profile of the underlying dye supply is an additional thread to consider. And I would say that that's probably more likely, the impact is what those rates have become over time versus higher rates in the past. It's unclear what the reasoning is for people driving down the overall collateralization ratio. It again may be a function of external parameters like the ETH price just being objectively lower lately. Again, hard to guess at that, but I don't think it's necessarily due to purely due to volatility, because as what we've seen in the past is as ETH drops in price, there's a rebalancing of collateral amounts and vice versa when ETH rises in price. So it's hard to say, but I don't think it's necessarily primarily due to volatility.
So considering that, so actually that in kind of like a nutshell, that would assume the actual risk appetite for the CDP holders, right? And that's kind of like a measure of the risk appetite for the CDP holders is having a low volatility rate, and they are in a way kind of paying exactly the same fees as the ones that actually have a lower risk appetite. Should actually potentially consider something, some measure around that, so that we can actually potentially drive a little bit behavior in terms of some of those CDP holders to have like a higher collateral range, because we are kind of basically, the assumption here, if I understand that thing correct, is that we are considering apples to apples people that have like risk appetites that are very different. And they bring some considerable risk to the overall system in case that low collateral rate becomes actually bad debt.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, right? So this is a dynamic dye supply with multiple different risk profiles baked into it, and we're using at the moment one rate for all of it. And as you segment that out, and as you sort of dynamically adjust based on different risk profiles, different rates, you're theoretically reducing economic waste in the system. So that should be a better way of thinking about it, just in theory.
Okay. So, yeah, I would like to have a little bit of a side discussion, maybe in a later stage with you about that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay, it feels like we might be winding down a bit. If anybody has any last minute questions or anything else they'd like to, yeah, there we go, Vishesh called it. Yeah, I can't handle the awkward silence. So if there are any other discussions we should be having, any other questions as relate to governance and risk, please ask them now. Otherwise, all right. I think that there's a lot to contemplate here. urgency versus apathy, the GSM, DSR spreads, well, and whether Mariano is living a better life than all of us, which is something that I've been considering for the most of this call. He might have discovered the secret. I think that's it for the first governance and risk call for 2020. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
See ya, everybody.